French resistance period, or fight. I shouldn't exaggerate fights. I mean, it won a couple of confrontations.
Yeah.
And the confrontation took place, but it didn't take place with him. It took place with somebody else. You know, like when he was...
I'd never heard that.
When he was in the French resistance, he was under the orders of a British agent. And the British agent did have a confrontation with de Gaulle. And Lou tells this vivid story about how they were both there, but Lou wasn't there. Lou was in the hospital in Toulouse with what's generally known as a social disease.
Yeah, that I believe.
And all kinds of other things. I had a long interview with his first wife, which is something.
You know, it looks fine on this monitor.
Okay.
Let me just, now show me a close-up. All right, it's rolling. Speed.
Okay. Your assignment to Vietnam in 1954 was largely based on your success in helping the Philippine government to fight its pro-communist guerrillas. First, how did you get the assignment to Vietnam, and do you think the Philippine experience was relevant to Vietnam?
The difference between my experience in the Philippines and the experience in Vietnam had many similarities and some very sharp differences that were important. I had visited Vietnam as part of a mission to check on the needs of the French forces fighting there in 1953. And later that year, I was in a meeting in the Pentagon that was called by President Eisenhower and was chaired by the Secretary of Defense, but had John Foster Dulles in it. And as they were talking about the results of our visit earlier in the year, John Foster Dulles, in replying to some question that was asked there, turned around and looked at me and said, well, we're going to send Ed over to Indochina, and don't you want to go? I said, well, I really don't, but if I could work with the Vietnamese rather than with the French, why, I'd be willing to go over and try and help out, but what is it you want me to do? He said, I'd like you to do the same thing you did in the Philippines. So that was the similarity. The differences were quite marked. In the Philippines, we were working with a government that had elected officials against an enemy that was trying to overthrow them and set up a new political system. In Vietnam, the officials in South Vietnam were either foreign, meaning French, or were appointed Vietnamese. So that the association and image that they gave to the people was not of being their own officials, but of being appointed and of strangers, foreigners. This was in a country that had a very deep suspicion of foreigners, even those who had been around among them for so long as the French had been. And as the Geneva Convention met and was deciding on the terms of the peace in Vietnam, the French made political sounds that they were going to move on. But what that meant was that they would move on almost an entire government leadership structure, not only in Saigon, but out in the provinces. So in the Philippines, I had helped the Philippine government and govern well and help the armed forces bring back essentially enough peace to have the government operate in favor of the people. And in Vietnam, the whole government structure was leaving the country, and the people out in the countryside had heard of Saigon. Some of them had visited there, but to them it didn't represent a government, and the structure had a great vacuum in it, so that the problems became very sharply different. The enemy, strangely enough, had remained very much the same type of an enemy, had grown much bigger in fighting against the French forces, but had started life as about the same number, the same size as the Communist Party and its armed forces in the Philippines, but had grown, about 3-4 times as large by the time it had gotten there, and kept growing all the time. And had successes which the Philippine communists had never had the successes that the Vietnamese ones had. Among the other contrasts on that are the problems that I had to deal with almost immediately in Vietnam was to help the Vietnamese take over and govern themselves. And they needed some encouragement and some guidance on that, so that as struggles would take place out in the provinces, there needed to be something other than a foreign element, meaning people from a big city, the capital city of Saigon, coming out to the countryside to work with the farmers and rice paddy people out in the provinces. In the Philippines, the problems had devolved into essentially military and political types. The military to protect the people, and the political to really represent the people, to let the people feel that it was their own choice of people that were governing them. I went to the Philippines the second time to help in the Hook Rebellion in 1950, and at that time the Hook guerrillas, the communist guerrillas, had achieved considerable success in dominating the provinces around Manila. But they had done so by claiming to the people that the elected government had not won fairly in elections. So that one of the big things that took place in the Philippines was advising the army to get in on the electoral process and helping the Commission on Elections there maintain the law according to what was on the books, so that they became, in effect, not poll watchers, but guardians of the sanctity of secret balloting. And the big turning points in the campaign against the communists there came about during 2 elections. The first one was a by-election in 1951, when governors and mayors of cities were elected, and the armed forces made sure that there wasn't fraud in around the polling places, and people who were running and who actually won the votes and were most popular were elected. And this, the people could clearly see that the government was theirs and was representing them, and had no use for people who were asking them not to vote and saying that their votes wouldn't be counted and that the government should be overthrown. In effect, the people said, well, we voted, our votes were counted, these are our people and it's our government, and we aren't going to help you overthrow it. There was no such feeling at all in Vietnam. The people said, who's that in Saigon? They're French, they're foreigners, we want them out of the country. And they didn't want to side with the communists by the time I got there. They had seen the communist organization, and most of them preferred to sit on the fence. And I think the great majority of people just wish that everybody would go away and leave them alone.
Looking back, do you think it was a mistake for the United States to have supported the French as far back, starting as far back as 1950?
A mistake supporting the French, 1950. Really not. I think that there were factors in our consideration of helping the French that went far beyond Vietnam and what the French were trying to do there. Don't forget they'd been our ally in World War II. We had very close cultural and economic ties with France. We were helping them bring some order and stabilization in a place that they said that they were going to get out of and leave there and make independent, which is what they told us, and I think that their eventual intent was to do that. There was a great deal of misgiving in Washington, as far as I could gather, about doing more than giving them some supplies and material things and not getting any further involved for ourselves.
Were you involved at all, or in Washington at the time, the Eisenhower administration, when the decision had to be made over whether to help the French at Dien Bien Phu? You remember that?
Yeah, I was in the Philippines at the time and not out of any first-hand knowledge at all about the decision on Dien Bien Phu and helping.
Could I ask your opinion? Do you think we should have helped the French at Dien Bien Phu?
Help the French at Dien Bien Phu. I think we were correct in our decision to stay out. I think we would have gotten involved and pulled in sort of backwards and had very little say about how things should be done. And we would have been caught in some combat action that we could neither control our own forces or those of other forces involved. And I don't think we could have saved the French at that time.
Now, you went to Saigon at the head of the Saigon military mission. Was this early 1954?
I went there in, let's see, I think it was May, towards the summer of '54. I was in Manila at the time. President Magsaysay of the Philippines had asked me to come in and help him on some of his work with his Congress there, many of whom were close friends of mine in the Philippines. And this was on his broad programs of work that he was trying to do inside the country, of social changes he was trying to bring about. And I got orders in while I was there to proceed immediately to Saigon. And I was appointed temporarily as an assistant attaché of the Air Force. And it wasn't until I got there and talked with General O'Daniel, who was head of our military mission in Saigon at the time, who asked me to also come out and help him with his MAG problems of training, and or not training at the time, of checking on military support to the Vietnamese.
What was Saigon like in those days, in early spring of '54?
It was wartime yet when I was there. There are lots of evidence on the streets of military traffic. The French had a great love for messengers on motorcycles, so you would notice in the heavily clogged traffic of bicycles and small French cars and taxis and cyclos, which are the motorized rickshaws of Vietnam. Suddenly these motorcycles of a French soldier hunkered down over the handlebars and wearing a helmet and going as fast as he could, weaving in and out of traffic, delivering some sort of a message from one headquarters to another. Many more trees than later in the American times of the war, and with lots of foliage out, somehow or other seeming more peaceful than it became later on, and a less hurried atmosphere as far as the Vietnamese were concerned. Many of the residents of Saigon in those days felt themselves to be fence sitters. They wanted no part of either side in the war, and went about their usual business, so that the sidewalks were crowded with people socializing and talking around the public pumps, and in the marketplaces there was much more leisure. Outside of seeing the military on the streets, it was a peaceful scene. The war was very remote to them.
It's been said that Saigon in those days was maybe one of the most corrupt cities in the world.
That and peace go along hand in hand, unfortunately, and many things. Saigon was corrupt, but corrupt in the sense that you'd see in any civilization, and that there were ways to beat the rules of the game of government. And then Saigon, in those days, the corruption was the worldwide one of gangsterism, of prostitution, of gambling, of normal illegal acts, the legality of any government. Later on, the corruption changed and became something quite else that ate away at the Vietnamese armed forces, and was more in the terms of graft than Saigon of those days. There was, in the earlier Saigon, there was usually in the downtown streets or around some of the side streets, you could get a heady whiff of opium on the air. That there were opium smoking circles that many of the Vietnamese and many of the French who were in the town would go over and have a pipe of an afternoon and thought nothing of it.
What was the Saigon military mission? That was an organization that you set up, wasn't it?
That was one that I set up.
I'm sorry, could you start by saying I set up the Saigon military mission?
I set up the Saigon military mission to have a mom and papa for a group of very unconventional military people that I'd brought together, who manned the direct aid section of our military advisory group to work directly with Vietnamese on a wide variety of subjects, including the psychological operations of the Vietnamese Army, and maintained help up in Hanoi to the refugee program while it was going on, and also performed some advisory duties into the civil government of Vietnam. And these were all military people, but their duties were a little bit apart from the ordinary military duties to fit a very peculiar need at the time. When the need was largely resolved, the mission was disbanded.
Was that group responsible to under the American military or under the CIA?
It was really responsible back to several people in Washington, including the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, the CIA, and to the Chief of Staff of the various services. Essentially, the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Well, with you and the other members of the group, were you getting paid by the CIA or by the State Department, or who was paying you?
Some of them were paid by CIA. I was paid by the Air Force. I was a regular Air Force officer. A number of the others were regular officers and were paid by their services, their military services while they were there. Some were in the State Department and were paid by the state as foreign service officers. The main difficulty with this type of a thing is that we were against an enemy in a struggle, an enemy that was halfway acknowledged by the United States, the communist forces, who had an organization for which we had no counterpart on our side. They had a cadre, a political cadre, a military cadre, who were often the same person, doing things that were way beyond a very formal type of organization that the United States had for such a struggle. And something was needed on our side that could counterpart them to make sure that everything that we did, or as much as possible of what we did, would be effective. Because some of their military leaders were more political leaders than they were military. Or if not, if they were as good a military leader, such as General Jacques, they had a very good political sense and would do things for political effect. And as most of Jacques' battles were for the political, psychological effect of what he did. And we had none of our people, the ambassador at the time, the generals that we had out there, the economic chiefs, were people who saw themselves, other than the roles assigned them in Washington, not as ambassador general or general ambassador or anything like that, but as playing a very straight role as Americans do.
But in this description, your group was a group of Americans trying to get into this military come political role, whereas on the communist side they were Vietnamese, so they had a kind of nationalistic credential. I mean,
Which we didn't.
We should go back and repeat the subject there. You know.
Our group were different from the communist side, in that the communists were Vietnamese and we were Americans, and we were acting as advisors to Vietnamese. And the important essential point in that is we were asking the Vietnamese to do things that were best for their country, and almost entirely we're asking them to do things their style rather than ours, based on their culture, their feelings of morality and principles that they believed in, but to do it for their country. And primarily, other than technical advice, which we gave at times, we were urging them to see the problem whole that they were looking at, because many of the Vietnamese that we were dealing with had no experience or very little experience in, for example, public administration. The military officers were by and large city boys who had to operate in the countryside and hadn't known farming, hadn't known the mores and background of rice paddy farmers and little villagers and so on, so that we stepped out of the role of having them do things American ways for American reasons or for our own country, but we're urging them to do things for their country, Vietnamese style, and in their way.
But you describe our Vietnamese as being largely city urban types. In many ways, weren't they just as foreign in the countryside of Vietnam as we were?
The officials and officers in particular, the Vietnamese government and armed forces, were city boys mainly because they needed at least a high school education to hold a job or to be an officer. The high schools were very far and few between in an ex-colony. I forget how many high schools, but there were very, very few of them. In order to get an education, you would have to go to a city and go to a high school. There was one university in Vietnam, the University of Hanoi. Again, it only had city people because it took money to go to school. It took a residence in a city while you were going to school. And even if you had come from the countryside as a young person, you would have to move into the city and grow up essentially in a city, picking up city ways and city outlook on life. So that when they would get out in the countryside, this was mostly new to them. And the people of Vietnam out in the countryside are xenophobic, and particularly so in the places where most of the combat took place in Vietnam, and where even people from the next village sometimes were looked on as foreigners. So when people came in who dressed differently, who had different faces, different skin coloration, they were definitely foreign. And it took people from that own vicinity to be accepted by them. That changed gradually as later as Americans fought out in the countryside, as they became familiar figures to the Vietnamese. But there's a little bit of that still inside them. The Vietnamese villagers of a little bit of hesitancy with any stranger.
You were a special advisor to Ngo Dinh Diem in those days. What was he like, and how would you describe his understanding of the situation in Vietnam?
I got to know Ngo Dinh Diem shortly after he came to Vietnam, returned to it in 1954 as a appointed prime minister of Emperor Bao Dai. And I became very close to him in a sort of an accidental way, and was never his official advisor. We became very close friends, and I did give him advice on many, many subjects with considerable guidance and discussion beforehand with U.S. officials, I might add. But I had never heard of Diem before I went to Vietnam, and he wasn't there when I was serving there in the earlier parts of '54. But word came that this man was coming in as prime minister, and I recall our ambassador at the time asking me what I knew about him. I told him I'd never heard of him, and he said he knew practically nothing about him. He just had a few brief notes on his biography, and I went out to find out about him from Vietnamese I knew. A number of them knew a great deal about him, and they either liked him fully and no holds barred, 100% for him, or 100% against him. He was a man of controversy. Those who were for him said that he was a very honest person, very acceptable to them as being a person of intensely high morality. Those who didn't like him said he's stupid. So they wouldn't fault him for anything other than they felt that he didn't know enough to be the boss. They felt that he wouldn't be corrupt, that he wouldn't condone graft, that he was a stickler morally. But they all knew him, and there wasn't a person that I talked to that didn't know a great deal about him. And they also told me that he had been an administrator in the provinces before and had made a name for himself by very strict but very thorough administration of problems for the Vietnamese who were then had a corded way. He was due in at the airport, Tan Son Nhut Airport, one day, and I was invited as part of the diplomatic group to go out and receive him. As I started out towards the airport, the streets were just lined with mobs of people, and I got a sudden impulse to pull off to the side and watch his arrival from the streets among the people rather than out the diplomatic crowd out at the airport. So I pulled in and I parked my car and got out and stood with the mobs on the sidewalks. And we waited and waited and waited for something to happen, and nothing did. And his flight apparently had been delayed, and the diplomatic reception out at the airport took a long time. But all of a sudden, down the street, we could hear a noise of motorcycles coming, and everybody said he's coming. So they were hoisting kids up on their shoulders, and everybody crowding out to see him, and I along with them. And suddenly, past us at about 60 miles an hour, came a motorcycle escort and a closed car. You couldn't see anybody in it. And it went by, and everybody started asking, was that him? You know, did he come in? And so on. And tremendous disappointment at not seeing him. Here was a tremendously enthusiastic, friendly crowd of people who didn't get to see the show that they wanted to, or to cheer the man. I felt that this had been a terrible mistake on somebody's part of letting a man come in at a very dark hour in his country's history, and doing it sort of secretively and very security-minded, as though he didn't want to get close to the people at all and stay away. So I went down afterwards to our embassy and talked with the ambassador, and also talked with the chief of MAG, General Daniel, and told him that I felt he'd made a tremendous mistake, and if somebody was advising him about the people, the way to make that sort of a mistake, he must be making mistakes on other things. And I had been traveling all over the country talking with all sorts of Vietnamese, and I knew what they wanted to see this man do, and if our American officials wouldn't mind, I'd like to write down some very short notes and outline for this man and go up and give them to him. They told me that they wanted to see what I was going to say first, so I went to work and stayed up all night writing a very short paper, 4 or 5 pages of notions on economics, on administration out in the countryside, of agricultural needs, and some reforms that would be made, and all of the things that the Vietnamese have been telling me of what they want this man to do. So I showed it to our officials, who told me to go ahead. I couldn't do it as an official U.S. document, but if I wanted to present it on my own and make sure that he knew it was on my own, go ahead with it. I didn't speak French, so I got the head of USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, George Hellier, to come along with me and act as an interpreter for me. So we went over to the government palace where the prime minister was. And the building was almost deserted. There were a few people wandering around in the halls, but I couldn't see anything that said the prime minister's office or any guards on the door to ask questions of. But one person hurrying along, I stopped and asked for the prime minister, and he said, he's upstairs. So we climbed up the stairs, and there was nobody in the hall up there, but there was a door ajar, and I stuck my head in, and there was a small-statured, roly-poly person sitting there, and the first thing I noticed was that his feet weren't touching the floor when he was sitting, and so he pulled up at a table. And I asked him where the prime minister office was, and he said that he was the prime minister. So this is the way I met Jim. Then I told him about being with the crowds, watching his arrival, and I felt that some advisor of his was making a terrible mistake of keeping him away from the people. And that I had had the good fortune of being able to travel around the country and talk to a lot of Vietnamese, and I'd put together some notes on my own that more or less said and outlined what the people expected of him and would he mind if I gave them to her. And I explained I was doing this strictly on my own as an American who had done this unofficially. So he took the paper, and then he was reading, and I said, well, I brought my friend here with me, George Hellier, who can read it to you in French and translate it. So George reached over and took this document, and he held it like this to read it, and then he held it way on out, and George said, I forgot my glasses, see, and I can't see the typing on this thing. So Jim took off his glasses and put them on George, and George then read it. And this was the start of a relationship that brought me in to see a part of him that I've never heard from anybody else, of a friendship that showed a character who was extremely different from journalist views of our diplomatic views of the man. I saw a family man, because I was invited to dine at times with a family, in which he wasn't the oldest brother, and he wasn't the boss of a country or anything. He was just one of the members of the family who you'd reach over if you wanted to grab a piece of food across his plate and so on. A man with a delightful sense of humor. Here he had been pictured all along as a remote Mandarin type, and he had a delightful wit. His humor was so dry that you'd have to look at him sometimes to catch whether he was pulling your leg or being sort of stupid about something, and I'd catch that little glint in his eye, and which reminds me, the man had a tremendous look of intelligence and spark of life in his eyes. The most important part of his features. There was always a sparkle, a little gleam there, and he catch the humor and so forth when he'd find something very funny and was holding himself in and sort of laughing inside at something. To an otherwise sort of roly-poly type of a person, this distinguished him from others of the same stature and in the any walk of life.
Excuse me. To what extent did he take your advice, and to what extent do you think that he, if you can give us some anecdotes of advice that you gave him that he took, and maybe if we could project a little bit to the future, were there any flaws in him that eventually contributed to his downfall?
The advice that I gave him was usually on a current problem that beset him, and I would ask him to describe the problem to me and get him talking about not only the problem, but how a Vietnamese who loved his country and was trying to serve the people should ideally resolve the problem. This type of a discussion would usually let him get his ideas sorted out and in some order, and in some order of priority, so that he would feel that something must be done, and would undertake something that was Vietnamese and his own, so that the taking of advice wasn't so much as taking my advice, but was taking his own advice as re-described by me and sorted out and put in some shape. Frequently, he would ask me how things would look to other countries, and I would answer that as best as I could. And we would get into considerable discussions of social philosophies and so forth, and including the Vietnamese approach to problems, so that he would take the advice because it was his own. I don't think he ever really dissembled to me on that. It wasn't that type of a relationship. There was no need for him to be dishonest at all in any way, nor on my part. We had extremely frank discussions on things.
Could you remember some examples?
One of the problems that he had personally was he was steeped in a Vietnamese Mandarin tradition, and I recall one time he was also an amateur photographer. He ran his own darkroom in the palace, but he was showing me some pictures taken of a visit to the provinces, which is something I was always urging him to do, to get out and talk to people. And as he did this, I said, well, shame on you. You've got these farmers out in the fields taking off their hats, and you're talking down to them. And because they must be bowing or something, they're afraid to look. And you can't get the truth from a man whose eyes you can't see, and who you aren't looking in his face and having a really man-to-man conversation. So tell them to keep their hats on, tell them who you are, and talk to them. When you start showing me pictures of you doing that, I'll think that you start learning what your own people want, and they won't tell you anything just to have you go away and feel happy, but you'll be getting the truth from them. He started doing that, and he would do dangerous things for his personal security. The first time we got him down to the Mekong area, where we were trying to get the government reestablished in areas that the enemy had left under the Geneva Accords, and it left a big gap in administration and so forth. It's a region of swamps and rivers and streams and so on. And Jim got in a boat and started rowing down a stream, and there were tall grasses all along the banks, and of course there were enemy guerrillas nearby. And he said, no, I haven't done this for a long time, you know. He enjoyed it, and he rode over to some farmers and talked to them and asked what things were happening there. But the main thing about him was that he was getting over some habits that had been with him all of his life. I think that he had mostly wanted to be a student monk, to live in a monastery someplace, and to do research and studies with probably history was his major subject. His main work in those days at the palace was done not in his office, not in any of the formal rooms of the administrative palace where he was, but in a little tiny alcove off of his bedroom, which was a place that the two of us, when we talked, our knees would touch together, like we're doing now, and a much smaller space than this. But he had all sorts of books and official documents and everything stacked from the floor to the ceiling, and he had a little tiny clear space on a table where he could do some writing, but so crowded in by books and papers and so on that he hardly see how the man could work there. And I thought, well, this is his monastery, his little monk's alcove. That this is part of the man, of a shy, retiring person who has been forced into the limelight, into the foreground, and doesn't really like it, but he's happiest when he's in a place like this.
Just one point. Could you mention?
Cutting to change tape. Okay. Sort of in the front of the.
Okay,
in
John,
front of the
we're
chair.
gonna roll. Well,
Oh, you got your stick.
no,
No, that's good. Okay,
yeah,
that's what.
you go out.
Okay, move. I'll go out. I'll go out. All right. Okay. A little more forward. Yeah. Good.
Want me to move forward?
No, no.
No,
It's the,
talk to me.
Oh, I see.
Your mugshot.
okay. I'm making myself light. Okay.
All right.
Stan, I don't think you'd actually finished this question. Were there any flaws in Zen?
Yeah, I want to go on to that.
All right. Anytime you're ready. Focus down.
Ready?
Fun. Go.
If you could, Ed, project a little forward, and could you talk a little bit about what were the flaws in Ziem, what were the shortcomings or weaknesses that contributed to his eventual downfall?
The main weakness of Ngo Dinh Diem in the early days of his holding office, the highest office in the land, was that he didn't trust his subordinates to get a job done correctly. In other words, he wasn't a good executive. He tended to want to do most of the work himself, and instead of delegating it to a cabinet member, to a member of his personal staff, or someone part of the executive department. The consequence of that was he had so much on his plate that he could just get one thing done at a time and do it rather slowly, because there were other pressures on him, other interruptions all the time, and he tended to put something to one side and hold it until he could come to a resolution of the problem and to do the actual signing of things and make the final disposition of things. This, of course, left a cabinet and a group of sometimes able, sometimes not so able Vietnamese not doing their jobs, wanting to, and becoming a little resentful of being left to one side. Another thing that happened was he knew a tremendous amount about the history and topography and resources, economic resources of his land. I have never met another Vietnamese that knew as much about those subjects as he did personally. When something would happen, he would tell me not only who had been involved, but would go into a family history, tell me who the man's father was, why he had handled something the way he had, and usually go back about 200 years in history about a particular little place in Vietnam to tell me why the people felt the way they did about things, and why this man who hadn't known that had gotten in, and it was too bad that he had done what he'd done, but his father had also taught him this, and he'd go into the history. Amazing detail. So that the end result was a fascinating person to talk to, but the talk would go on and on while the kettle was boiling with political problems coming up and crisis situations and so forth, which he wasn't meeting at the time. Then he finally became busy doing his job of delegating some things and getting the papers off of his desk and working things through. But as he did that, there was suddenly missing from his life a lot of gossip about the people to keep him current with all these families that he knew and other people. And the person who supplied that was his brother New. Now, his brother New had organized intelligence services to serve the country, initially to be focused against the enemy up in Hanoi, but increasingly so, political gossip about rivals and opponents and some supporters throughout the country in South Vietnam. And I noticed, and after I'd left Vietnam in '56, and coming back on visits in later years, briefly, that the gossip about people became a little more biting when Jim would tell me, and a little more vicious about people than had ever been known before. And as a friend, I had warned him not to just rely on one source of information, but to spread it out and turn to friends as well as his brother and get different viewpoints of what was happening up in areas. And if the views became too contradictory, to get up and see something for himself. I think that towards the end of his life, he was relying a great deal on his brother New for information about a situation, to get a political feel of the feelings of the people in an area or of a group. And perhaps his brother New was a little bit captive of his own intelligence agents and people out gathering information who were sometimes self-serving. So a wrong view came up of like the situation and way that caused his final, his actions against Buddhists up there that caused his final downfall. And his reactions were those of a man at the end of a long pipeline of information and seeing things only from an office and from a capital city and from a background that he had never had before, and that if he had gone up and eyeballed these things himself, had gone up and seen for himself, had talked to people for himself, he was making decisions that I don't think he ever would have if this had been his own from first-hand views.
What was your impression of his brother New? What kind of a man was New?
His brother New was, first of all, a very handsome person. He could have made a career as a leading man in Hollywood. Clean cut, sort of a boyish charm to him, extremely bright, masterfully intelligent person, a very charming smile, and one to turn the heads of any woman that saw him, because this was happening to some of the American gals who were in Vietnam that I knew, who used to tell me how good-looking the man was. Bright in that he had a good education. He was intellectually ahead of most of the people that he was around at the time, and with that, of course, came an ego that let him look at whatever he said and came to conclusions about as being practically infallible. And I think he was deceiving himself there. He needed an ego to be in the position that he was in, but it finally ran away with him. I think finally he probably thought he was smarter than his brother and knew best for the country what to do more than his brother did. And I think that the family relationship broke down somewhat at that point. I suspect that the long loyalties between the two had become somewhat abraded at the time. Not terribly so, but it was fraying at the time. I last saw the two of them in 1961, and ordinarily I had just seen Jim alone, at least for a period. And Jim had asked me to come in and see him at the palace. And his brother sat there, his brother New sat there in our conversation. And I would ask Jim a question, and his brother would answer it. And I'd say, I didn't ask you, I asked your brother here. And I was begging Jim to respond directly to his own feelings. And I'd ask him questions about the situation and about some of the rival political figures and some who had been loyal to the government but opposed to Jim personally, so that I could talk about them freely with Jim. And I was quite surprised that the relationship between the two had disintegrated a bit. Now, Jim had been charged by his father to take care of his younger brother, New. So and he was very happy to do so, very proud of looking out for him, very proud of New's intellectual abilities, and boastful a bit about it, as you would be of a younger brother that you felt was really getting ahead. But, pardon me, this had changed somewhat in '61. Of course, the overthrow took place 2 years later, so all I can presume is that this situation must have continued to grow of little difference between the brothers.
What about Madame New?
Madame New is perhaps one of the most tragic figures of our day and age, in that she was a lovely lady who has grown into the image of a tiger lady, of a person of tremendous emotional bitterness, of unguarded tongue, and almost a vicious manner towards others. Madame New came from a very prominent social and political economic family from North Vietnam, and from central North Vietnam, who was brought up by a beautiful mother, a socially elite father group, family group, in which the daughters were trained to make very good marriages, financially and socially, and she knew all of the social graces of a hostess in a household of wealth and culture, so that her training was to be the gracious lady who would invite people and knew how to make conversation at the dinner table, could entertain at the grand piano in the salon, and live a life of quiet charm. She married a man who looked as though this was going to be his life in a colonial Vietnam. But in her more mature days, as she started to have children, as life became more interesting to a gal, she would come in to ask if anybody would like to hear her play a piano in the salon. Her husband was busy with his brother. There was some terrible problem taking place. There might be military types come running in with their problems, and there might be an alarm that the palace was about to be bombed, or something very unladylike taking place, something very unsocial. And the men would say, no, no, you leave us alone now. So she couldn't act her true role that she had trained for in life. So she tried to move over into their field to be closer to them. And as such, as she loomed into the limelight more and more, she attracted much malevolence and public opinion and so forth, with herself as a target. And I recall talking to her in later years, in which she told me of how much it hurt her all the time to be hated. And she had emotional problems from this feeling of hatred, and this was being expressed in ways that she would see in the press, in conversations and journalistic talks with her and so on. And this hurt her very deeply inside. And I think that a lot of her responses that seem so ugly to us in the context were her attempts to use words that she didn't know quite their fine meanings. I think her talks about barbecuing monks came as she was trying to use American slang with American reporters that were just terribly out of place. And she had been hurt by some of the American diplomats' wives who had become rather catty in her presence about what she was up to. Even her personal sex life was being maligned all the time, that she was sleeping with this, that, or the next general or person in the Vietnamese army, or in the cabinet and so on. But instead of doing such activities, she was in the nursery with the kids and so on. And this hurt.
Some of the Vietnamese generals spread these stories themselves, and we know
To both, it could be. The generals would find it originally possibly to their liking. And some of the Vietnamese generals also looked like Hollywood movie idols, you know, and it helped their image a bit.
Do you think there was nothing to those stories?
I think there might have been friendships between some of these people and Madame New. I'm not an expert on whether what happened when I wasn't around, but when I was there, the behavior was completely acceptable socially, and I didn't see any side glances or touching going on, you know, hands or hips or whatnot. I really don't believe there was anything more to that, Brother Cal.
One thing we tend to overlook is that there were other brothers in that family. And, for example, would you say that the influence of some of the other brothers was very strong on Diem, the bishop, for example?
Some of the other brothers did have influence, and the bishop, the oldest brother in particular. Some of them were out of the country most of the time because Diem trusted them, and he would send them on diplomatic missions. One was at the court of St. James as the Vietnamese ambassador. Another was in France as a very important buffer between the French government and the absentee Emperor Bao Dai, who was down in the Riviera, and Saigon. And one brother, who the youngest of them all, who stayed up and stayed with Mama and kept the family home going up in Hawaii. But the bishop took was a person, first of all, whose activities were out in the countryside, and in his later days, he was down in the south in the Mekong Delta, and frequently in the midst of fighting between the VC and the Vietnamese Army. But a man with a very wide acquaintance with the people in the villages and the farmers in the countryside, who would bring this knowledge with him when he talked to his brother, and was very blunt in talking to his brother about what people felt. And sometimes when I was a little worried about too much information one-sidedly coming from Brother New, I would urge him to get his brother, the bishop and later archbishop, and to ask him what was happening there, or to let him go and visit a part of the country and find out his own views on the thing, come back and tell him.
One point about that you haven't mentioned, and that was that you mentioned that Diem was had in many ways a Mandarin outlook. The other thing is that he was a Catholic, which was not a majority religion in Vietnam. Do you think really that he was the kind of man to govern a country that was in a revolutionary situation?
Was Jim the man who, a Catholic of a minority group, a man to lead a country in a revolutionary situation? Let me answer it this way. He was a man who had been in public life before, which few other Vietnamese had been. He had made a name for himself as early on, while he was part of the court at Hue, urged the French to give independence and freedom of action to Vietnamese to govern themselves. This was a very courageous stand that he had taken, and one that was well known throughout the country. For that reason, Ho Chi Minh had urged him to join Ho's government, and it wanted him as a very independent, highly patriotic person. So in Vietnamese eyes, here was a patriot heading the country in times of stress. Now, there surely is nothing wrong with a patriot heading up a government in a revolutionary system or situation. When almost everybody in Vietnam knew that Ho Chi Minh had wanted him into a very important post in the early coalition government that the communists had formed. His shortcomings were those of practically any Vietnamese at the time, since none of them had really held high administrative or executive posts in the country. Many of the Vietnamese who later became ministers or chiefs of departments or bureaus in their government had to sit out practically at the door during French times and be the receptionist. And some of them knew that in this bureau or this department, the main piece of work was to stamp papers. Now, this is what the French had trained them to do, not to run a department, not to run programs, but to sit there and be clerks. And they had a great deal to learn about handling their own affairs and running a government.
One observer in Vietnam, or an American certainly, Doug Pike once referred to Vietnam as the land of the double cross, in which all Vietnamese are maneuvering against each other, that there's very little cohesion in South Vietnam. Could you comment on that?
Well, Vietnam had its major social problems out of the lack of cohesiveness in its society. There were families, and it's basically a family structure, but once you leave the confines of a village, which is not only the basic unit in Vietnam, politically and socially, but it's perhaps the only place where there is some cohesion, where elected rulers, executives, actually reflect the will of the people and are accepted by the people. Once above that level, there are rivalries afoot, and the xenophobia of a village, of even people from 10 miles away, of being dirty foreigners, certainly extends in their, or it did extend in their national political life. So that the mistrust of a foreigner, meaning someone from another province or another city or another town or village, is very evident in their attempts at political organization. Political parties have always had a hard time. They no sooner start organizing than they get splinter groups branching off. The political party that Brother New headed and tried to put together to the Can Lao became splintered, but held together principally because there were civil servants who were members, and one person in the civil service would tend to accept another person in the civil service as somebody who was known and not a foreigner. So that was its main strength and also its main weakness, and that to be a member of the club meant that you weren't fired from a government job because you were a member, so that it became, in its membership, a little bit too self-serving of members rather than of the public. And that's where some corruption started in the Gem days. And the real tragedy of Vietnam was that the Vietnamese were never able to get together and rule themselves by accepting others long enough to let them take over the executive job and being accepted by people, even though they elected people. The very last day I was in Saigon in 1968 in the summer, a lot of the small town provincial politicos had wanted to come and say goodbye to me. And a lawyer friend of mine, Vietnamese, had invited them into his home in Saigon. He lived in a very small home on a dirt street. And so many people showed up for this that there was to be a luncheon in his house. That the meeting couldn't take place in his house. It was too small, so we sat down along the curb of this dirt street and talked to each other. And there were several hundred of these politicians from all over the country. And the neighbors came in and brought soft drinks and food for the lunch to us. They were cooked in all these different homes around. And the theme of my farewell to them was, for God's sakes, learn to work with each other. And unless you unify, you're going to lose your country, you're going to lose your homes, and probably lose your lives. But during the thing, I would ask a man what he believed about something. And he would tell me what he believed, and usually very idealistic, highly principled. And several others would be looking at him as he'd do this and say, I never knew that you believed in that. That's what I believe in. And I said, that's the trouble with you. You never talk to each other enough to discover that you share a great deal in common. I got back to my house to finish packing to come back home. And the phone was ringing, and it was then President Thieu. And he wanted to see me right away. I went over to the palace to see him, and he told me that the police his police, he said, had reported to him that I was fomenting a revolution out in the streets with all these politicians from all over the country. And I said, no, I'm doing something I'm very angry at you about. He said, why are you mad at me? I said, it's your job as president of the country to talk to all these people and get them in and get their views and to somehow or other get them working together. I said, that is a leader's job. And I said, don't let a foreigner, don't let an American like myself do it. I'm leaving. And they were saying goodbye. I'll never see them again, I don't think. So how about you starting to act like a president for a change? And he was quite taken aback by that. And incidentally, turned around then and gave me a painting as a farewell gift. But he said, I thought you were starting a revolution to overthrow me, and I wasn't going to give you this painting until now. So he changed his mind.
Let's go back to the early period. One of Diem's big achievements, maybe it was your achievement too, was how he managed to defeat all these different sects and groups that were trying to overthrow him in the mid-50s. What were these groups?
The sect troubles, which ran a little bit in 1954 late and then got to their climax in the spring of 1955, were two religious sects and one underworld organization of an underworld social type of group in the urban area of Saigon, Sholan. The religious groups were the Cao Dai from along the border of Cambodia, about due west of Saigon, and the Hoa Hao, who are a group where recent, just below the so-called Parrots Peak, down near the Gulf of Thailand, southwest of Saigon. And then in the city itself, a sect of the Ben Xuan, who had originally organized as sort of a democratic social club of welfare and so on, but whose leadership had taken over controlling all of the narcotics traffic, mostly opium, all of the prostitution and the commercial prostitution and the gambling in the city, and had obtained from Bao Dai the right to select the chief of police of the city area there, the urban area, allegedly for a large sum of money. But they essentially felt that they should control the city and control the country and elect their own people to move in and take charge and run things, rather than a man whom they looked upon in the form of Diem as a Puritan, of a goody-goody, of a person that was really acting against their own personal self-interest. So they met secretly and decided on which one was going to be the boss when they overthrew this man, and who was going to have jurisdiction over what. But they started in, first of all, by trying to negotiate with him. And when Diem wouldn't trust them at all and essentially threw them out of the office and wouldn't talk with them, they decided to use force to force him out. Now, a lot of people were involved in what happened next. The French still had armed forces in the area and moved some more in as this discussion started getting hot. The troops that belonged to these sects, they all had armed forces, an army, were militia in the French army and had been under control of the French almost entirely. There were some exceptions. And the main thought on the other side was if they could get rid of Jim physically by blowing him up, by killing him, they could move in and take over. They moved their troops into the city, positioned mortars to shell the palace, and while both the French forces and the Americans who were there were trying to defuse the situation, trying to bring about a peaceful solution to the thing and resolve some of the claims that the SEC forces were making, which included some things that happened at very unfortunate timing. The French said, we are giving our independence to South Vietnam, which means that we can no longer pay militia, which they did at this critical moment. And the SEC said, well, somebody's got to pay us, you know, we've got armed forces to help defend the country, and why don't you make me the commander of all the armed forces, one of them said, and we'll take over the defense of Vietnam. And others said, make us part of the Vietnamese army and pay us the same, and we'll take over and run the things. To all of which, of course, Jim said nothing doing. But the French were trying to come up with solutions, and General A. Lee, who was the commander of the French Expeditionary Forces in Indochina, asked me, along with the U.S. ambassador, General Taylor at the time, to, excuse me, it wasn't General Taylor, General Collins, asked me to head up a French-American group to come up with solutions to this problem, which included what do you do with demobilized troops, how do you get them into gainful employment, how you resolve some of the economic needs of the areas where these people come from, and turn them from being belligerents into peaceful citizens. About the time we were wrestling with coming up with the answers to these problems, the Ben Zuan, who were in Saigon and owned essentially Sholan as a gangster territory of theirs, opened fire with mortars on the palace, hoping to catch Jim in a place and kill him. I talked to Jim just before, and I'd gone up to give him a message from both the General A. Lee and Ambassador Collins that we hadn't come up with solutions yet, but we were very hopeful, and we wanted him to hold off precipitating any fight. And Jim was laughing at me. We were out on the front porch, and he said, you were standing about where I think the first shell is going to hit, and it's going to be coming in about 20 minutes, and you better get out of here. And I'm not initiating. I'm receiving here. So, and sure enough, 20 minutes later, the firing broke out against him. And he told me, he was on the phone, he said, listen to my orders. And he got General A. Lee on the phone and had him listen. And he said, listen to this incoming shells, and I'm giving some orders here for counterfire. And with that, he gave orders to his artillery to open up on the mortars that were firing.
Just a minute. Were you, so it was just a battle. There was no, did they actually fight it out in the streets?
They were fighting in the streets. This took place and started in the evening and went on until almost midnight that day in the dark. And the French had moved forces in to try and control the situation. But what was happening was the Vietnamese army, which by French estimates at the time, and by estimates of some of the Vietnamese in the cabinet even, were that the Vietnamese army wouldn't fight. And they had rushed into Saigon, the Vietnamese army. And I remember seeing one group in front of us in a schoolyard getting ready to move down a few blocks, and I asked them how they were feeling, and they were grabbing their rifles and throwing them in the air and let's go attitude, and just the reverse of what the diplomatic corps had observed, which the French headquarters had said they were. They said that they wouldn't fight and didn't want to, but they were eager to get in and settle a problem.
Were you acting as an were you acting as an advisor to Diem on how to handle the sects?
No. I was seeing Diem about once or twice a week at his invitation, and once in a while I would go in when our ambassador would ask me to go in and convey something to him. He knew that I was working on the sect problem, trying to resolve it. He knew that I was a close friend of one of the sect leaders, who was Trin Mante, who was head of the Cao Dai dissident group that had split away from the regular Cao Dai, and a close friend of the commander-in-chief of the Cao Dai Armed Forces, and General Fong. And I had asked them not to participate with the others, which they pulled out and didn't do. But on this problem of the thing, I had very strict orders from the U.S. and from our ambassador to not be in the palace when any fighting started, and not to give any military advice on how to cope with the enemy, but to pull out. And Diem was very much aware of this. And I think that was one of the reasons he was teasing me that I was standing where the first shell was going to hit. And he told me where the batteries were and so on. He had excellent intelligence from his brother knew.
Weren't it's generally assumed that the French at that stage were trying to get rid of Diem. Is that true?
The French had a feeling about Diem that was exacerbated by their having lost a war, and by their having to give up a colony and to pull out of a country. And they felt that by having a nationalist, a patriot, if you will, such as Diem heading the government that was supplanting them, that this was sort of rubbing salt into a very sore wound of theirs. And they felt and said frequently that Diem was arousing the people against the French. And a lot of that rubbed off on me, that they also said that I was the one that was trying to arouse a revolutionary spirit among the Vietnamese to be anti-French. And this simply wasn't so at all. I had to remind the French that they had been fighting against the Vietnamese for 8 years before I ever showed up on the scene, and that I hadn't started that war or been a part of it, and that this was just a natural consequence of combat. And
now, you had some disagreements, so it's been reported that you had disagreements with the American ambassador, General Collins. What were these disagreements about?
Well, the only one that was sort of...
I'm sorry, did you repeat that you had disagreements?
My only disagreements with Ambassador Collins, General Collins, concerned the matter of the feelings of the Vietnamese on given problems. And one of the times was when the first night of fighting the sects against the government of Diem, along about 10 or 11 at night, the ambassador asked me to come over to his residence and see him immediately. And I drove in past much of the fighting then going on. The French were bringing up armor to hold strong points in the town, and blocking off Vietnamese army units who were going in to reinforce some people who were some army, their own army units, who were holed up in a police station in Cholan, and needed reinforcements badly. And the French tanks were blocking the way, and I drove on past that up to the ambassador's residence and started telling him that the French were interfering one-sidedly in this fight that was going on. And the ambassador told me that he and General A. Lee had come to an agreement, and the French had the forces there to reinforce and make the decision stick of a truce and ceasefire immediately. Everybody to stay in their positions that where they were, and that he'd gone along. I felt that he had a very misinformed view of what was going on in the town, because he still believed that the Vietnamese army wouldn't fight, that this, in essence, is the truce would give the government of the country, Jim and his people, a chance to sort things out and maybe come up with some viable, workable, peaceful solution of compromise with the other side, when actually the Army and Jim had a very viable thing going for them if we'd let them alone.
Was Ambassador Collins cool to the idea of supporting Diem?
I would say so. He didn't.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
General Collins looked upon Jim much as the French did. He was had a close friendship with many of the French officers then in Vietnam. That is, General Collins did. He grew to adopt and accept their viewpoint of Jim as a nationalist who would put his head down and go against anybody's grain just to have his own way, and had no real chance to know him. Usually when they met personally to talk, Jim would catch something in the ambassador's tone or words that he used that led him to think that this man doesn't know the country or the people or the situation, and at which point Jim would become the professor and educator and take time out to start telling him what the situation really was. And sometimes Jim would talk for hours on this thing and get carried away with a lecture, so that he would lose the attention and interest of a man who wanted to come to a decision quickly and to get something done. So that there was a personal difference between our ambassador and the prime minister, as well as sharing and sympathizing with the French views of it.
Do you think that Diem was?
We're cutting to change tape.
Okay.
Became what, deputy chief of staff or something?
Yet now at the time, supporting Diem. For example, in the referendum between Diem and Bao Dai, remember the story about the different colored ballots? Was that your idea?
Yeah, but I wanted to.
Yeah, listen, we got to do the record. I just wanted to. Okay, let's be candid about it. I mean, you've talked about this publicly. Yeah.
And I think they were burned up in the first attack on the palace by those that overthrew it. And I have a hunch that the Vietnamese army scrambled out of there so fast they left those things behind. There might be copies around here. I don't know.
Okay. Roland? In those days in Saigon, you used various Psy-war techniques in support of Diem, the kind of stuff that would these days might be called dirty tricks. Could you describe some of them, particularly, let's say, in the referendum between Diem and Bao Dai, and if you could possibly recall the date of that?
The Psy-war psychological operations that I got into in Vietnam initially were with the Vietnamese Army, who had a G5, or Psychological Operations Division, in their Army, who had very scant equipment and who were hesitant about undertaking operations against the then Vietnam, the communist troops, simply because of the lack of equipment. And most of my original advice to them was how to wage it without much equipment, and word of mouth, rumor campaigns, and so forth, which they later undertook up in North Vietnam and along the defenses of the Red River Delta, and where they did have use of loudspeakers that would carry at least a couple of miles. It was better than any equipment I'd seen before, which was French equipment. How to use that. So it was a word of mouth type of a thing. Later on, a referendum you're speaking of between Diem and Bao Dai as a leadership was tied in with another piece of advice or imploring that I was giving Diem, was to make it an honest election, to get a true result in the thing that the people themselves had been honest, felt would have been honest, and they would accept the end result without need for anything further being done on it. Some of the people around Diem wanted to stuff the ballot boxes and do some things, and I felt very strongly against that and was advising strongly against that. And they said, well, how can you influence? I said, well, if you want to do something, you're going to run the pictures of both men, and the balloting will be, you put the picture, a piece of paper with a picture on it, in the ballot box. This was because many of the voters were illiterate and needed symbols to vote with. And I said, if you're that much afraid of the thing, and I'm sorry to hear that you're afraid of the result, because my own talking around with people so that you're going to win overwhelmingly, and you don't need to cheat. If you want to prejudice the favor, print the picture of Bao Dai in a color that will be unfavorable, so that people will feel like throwing it away and putting the picture of Diem in the ballot box. And the colored green has got a bad connotation out there among the people traditionally. So Bao Dai's picture on this ballot was printed in green, and people threw that away and when they went in to vote and used Diem's picture. So I think he would have won anyhow.
What color was Diem's picture?
His was black. Initially, it was going to be red, which is a happy color in Vietnam. But then they figured the communists used red symbols, and they didn't want him to have any look of the communists about him. People were really against the communists, and not for Diem as much as for anybody at the time that would show them an alternative to going communist in their government.
When did the referendum take place?
That was in 1955, about April, or no, it's after April, May. The fighting in Saigon took place in April, May. The referendum took place about a month later. So my recollection is it took place in June or possibly early July.
I'm sorry, General. You had a problem.
None of it worked.
Yeah.
When did the referendum take place?
The referendum for a people's choice between Bao Dai and Jim took place about June or July of 1955.
Do you remember what the results were?
The results were about 99% for Jim and about truly about 90-some% for Jim. I think there was a little bit of influence of the voters on that, but I think that Jim's true vote would be about 90% for him.
So are you satisfied that it was an honest election?
I think it was honest enough in its overall decision by the people. I think it reflected the popular will.
Now,
Incidentally, I've become an expert on dirty elections by trying to guard against them. And it's one of the reasons I've always worried that we would attempt in any international problem to resolve them by a popular plebiscite. Because I don't think that the nice people from the West and our politicians from good cultural backgrounds know enough of the dirty tricks that would be played by the other side to be able to guard against it.
Now, one of your major efforts at this time was the operation to encourage Vietnamese in the north to come down to the south. How many came down? What kind of Psy-war techniques were used there?
Well, the big movement of refugees from North Vietnam to South Vietnam started in late 1954 and reached its climax in early 1955. The decision that people had to make is quite similar to the decisions that they are making today, even as we're talking here, about getting out of the country and going someplace else. They had to give up a family home and leave the family holdings and ancient cultural backgrounds, even have a religious meaning to them. It's very deeply held by the people, and go to a strange new place and start life all over again. And this was extremely hard for the people up in North Vietnam to do. At the time, they needed several types of reassurance, and their attention called the thing in a period of great crisis and emotional upset to them, so that the efforts on the propaganda were informative and also sort of urging them or nudging them real hard to come to a decision quickly, because there would be a period when free movement wouldn't be permitted. So that the nudging on the thing was part of psychological operations that were disguised as the communist orders to their cadre inside of the big cities, the main populated areas, to undertake things that were later done by them. In other words, it was a wrong timing for the communists.
Excuse me a second. I think we're getting. There's an airplane going overhead, and we're going to start.
All you have to do is wave into the window.
Let me repose the question. When we talk about the encouragement and the Psy-war techniques, could you be a little more specific? I know you've written about this and talked about it. such things as, remember the Virgin Mary's going south and,
Well, the propaganda, the psychological operations to really to encourage the people up in North Vietnam to come to a final decision and move south, give up their homes, their backgrounds, their ancestral shrines and religious, spiritual beliefs of the people, ran a very wide gamut of things, and were devised in large part by Vietnamese who were up in the Hanoi area and at a time of great demoralization wanted to do something to express their feelings. So there were a number of things that happened. One of the means was orders out to people in the name of the Communist Party, which were fake orders, to have inventories made of the goods that they were holding, to account for all their funds that they had, and South Vietnamese piasters that would be exchanged for North Vietnamese dong or a different currency in the rate of exchange. All of these reminders of what was about to happen, in effect, which were such that the communist cadre who was secretly operating inside of Hanoi at the time thought that they were real orders coming out from their own headquarters out in the countryside, and helped distribute these orders to the people. And the people outside got messages into their headquarters inside Hanoi to cease and desist doing such a thing, and the people inside Hanoi, the communist cadre there, thought that this was a French operation on the messages to them allegedly from their own headquarters, and didn't believe them. But this and a religious group of Catholics, we're talking about the Virgin Mary going south, and tremendous emotion about this.
how was this business, this line of the Virgin Mary going south? How was that broadcast? How was that? How did you diffuse
This was
that?
all word of mouth, or some of it was by leaflet. There were a number of leaflets being produced up in North Vietnam by Vietnamese groups. The Catholics had two bishops with them who were, and they had their own militia, they had their own armed forces, and were giving direct orders and information to their people, who were moving up out of their area from the countryside up into ports of debarkation up in the north. And some people were very reluctant about leaving home. Their families had been there for many, many generations. So the orders to these people and pleadings with them started turning into sharper and sharper form to get them to move and to have them obey their original impulse to leave, which many of the people had already, but to overcome their reluctance at a time of great demoralization of the people.
Were you advising anybody on these Psy-war techniques?
Usually, I was advising the Vietnamese that undertook these, and many of the Vietnamese were extremely belligerent on what they wanted to do, and I was trying to get them to be a little more rational and a little less destructive in what they were doing, and still be effective.
Do you recall any particular device that you invented that you thought was good?
Well, I recall one example. The Vietnamese are quite superstitious as a people and believe in soothsayers, and they were
gonna have to hold up that quiet a minute.
Yeah,
Loud jet.
we got the wind. Is that the Concorde? Concorde come over here?
I haven't heard it before. I don't think so. I think this is out of NASA.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to go back on that one. Could you recall one particular device that you...
One example of what was done in that period was to play on the superstitions of the Vietnamese by and their the place in their society that soothsayers have by putting out a sort of an almanac prediction, a publication of predictions for the near future of what was going to happen up in North Vietnam. That a number of the soothsayers themselves, who were professional fortune tellers, contributed to in their writings, and was actually put on sale up in the Hanoi, Haiphong area, and made a lot of money. But it was done by a group that was a non-profit group who really didn't know quite what to do with the money when it became a sort of a bestseller. But the fortune telling in this almanac was very accurate, in that it was realistic, and it told what was going to happen in the following months, which were based on communist organizational practices already, and which happened. And then went on, got quite fanciful in predicting a future which didn't quite turn out that way. If it had, why Vietnam would not be communist today.
What? Can you remember specifically the sort of things that were predicted?
Ooh, remembering details that far back, that was 34 years ago, wasn't it? Oh,
25,
20.
25 years.
Okay. I can't remember enough on that.
Okay. Let me ask you to make some sort of a judgment here, an opinion. Roughly 1 million people moved south. Is that
That's correct.
A large number were Catholics. And that created a strong anti-communist bloc in South Vietnam, an irredentist movement in a sense. Looking back, do you think it was useful really to have encouraged that? Because it really sort of made conciliation between the North and South difficult in the future. Or, would it have been, in other words, do you think in retrospect that we created a very hardcore anti-communist group in the South that was going to make negotiations very difficult in the future?
Well, in looking at the refugee movement flow from north to south of close to 1 million Vietnamese, it's hard to make judgments of whether this should have happened or shouldn't have happened, or whether the U.S. should have helped or shouldn't have helped in the problem. The point is that we as a people, our instincts are humanitarian, and I don't think that the United States, with means to do things, could have, as a people, as a nation, stood by and watched a lot of people trying to get south with no means to go south. And I think that there would have been about as many people going south by themselves and under their own determination as almost a total number of them. They would have been streaming out for years, just as we see the people gambling with their lives on leaving Vietnam today. But in political terms, the movement took place at a time when there was still an agreement that had been reached at Geneva between the powers, in which there was hopes for a plebiscite to let people decide what their country was to be afterward. So part of the political problem with it was to have enough people in the side where there'd be freedom of expression by a vote, or some freedom of the ballot box, as against a predictably closed system up in the north under the communists on voting, but enough so that the free choice of the people could be properly and truly expressed. So all of the people who were coming south were essentially to be voters, voting their own desires in a plebiscite that was looked upon as coming up in the future. The fact that it was later canceled doesn't negate what the thinking was at the time about that.
Who was really in charge of the actual movement? I mean, we were using American ships and American aircraft and so forth. Who was in charge, from the American point of view, of the movement?
Well, the movement was managed.
We don't need the question. Go ahead and answer it.
The movement of refugees was governed by an executive who was Vietnamese, appointed by Jim, and had an organization that was Vietnamese in its manning. There were separate problems in that required technicians of a very high order. Jim had been quite mindful of the Palestinian refugees, and the fact that there were still refugee camps in the Middle East where the people stuck in the camps and not able to take up productive, meaningful lives where they were. And he was determined that he didn't want big camps in the South of people who were farmers not being able to farm, or fishermen not being able to fish, and so on. So there had to be all sorts of technical help on the movement that went beyond the usual one. Part of this was on transportation from the north to the south. Both the Americans and the French used their own transport, both by air and by sea, to get people out, and by ground over the highways to get them down to ports of embarkation. And they would have liaison officers with the Vietnamese agency and would advise them, we have to do this next. We're getting so many people in this camp, we've got to move them out, and will you please come up with some orders and some way of getting them out onto ships or whatever, and then getting them from the ports of debarkation in the south out to temporary camps, and then very quickly out into new communities. And in this, a lot of Americans pitched in. We had to use the Americans that were on the scene, which included our military. General Bill Rawson, for example, was in charge of the initial reception of refugees into camps in the South, and aboard ships and aircraft and into temporary shelters, and then seeing that they'd get out. But he followed directions from and worked under the directions of a Vietnamese executive. And he's still mad at me, incidentally, for one night when he was out at midnight when a ship came in, and people streaming off the ship were handing him their little children to hold while they picked up baggage and then took the children back. And he said most of them had to go to the bathroom and were wetting all over his uniform. And he wondered why American Army officer of high rank and dignity should be subjected to such a thing. But like all of us in the military, we have a tremendous fondness for children and helpless people that need protection. And this more than made up for his
You remember
discomfort.
You recall that there was somebody who really sort of claimed to have played a major role in this was Tom Dooley.
Tom Dooley was a somewhat controversial figure in Vietnam. He was in the Navy at the time, the U.S. Navy, and was brought in by part of by the U.S. Navy Task Force to help at the port of embarkation up in Haiphong up in the north, and set up a medical team to work down on the docks and with the people as they were getting crowded aboard these Navy transport to go south. Whatever else one might say of Tom Dooley, the look on his face as he was treating helpless people.
Just start it at that stage.
You're saying that none of the answers. All right. It doesn't sound that much better than what we began before.
Sorry about the pause. Whatever else.
They say they have to have the whole thing.
No, it's not that. I think that's all really the important part of it.
It got spoiled and all that time.
What was Tom Dooley's role in the great movement of refugees south?
Tom Dooley became quite a controversial figure in the American community out in Vietnam. But Tom initially was in the Navy and came in with the U.S. Navy task force that was bringing people by sea from North Vietnam to the south, and set up a medical team on the docks there in Haiphong, and worked day and night with the people trying to look after their medical needs as they were getting aboard transport. Because these were people that had just been pulled out of home and been on the road for days of walking, and had to bring their sick and their ill and those needing some first aid attention right along with them. But the controversy was that some of the Americans out there thought that Dooley was a very conceited person, which he had some conceit to him. But anybody that ever went down and watched the look on Dooley's face as he treated these people, a look of compassion, of deep sympathy, wouldn't feel that way about him. He was, whatever else one might say it was, that he exuded a genuine love for the needs of these people, and a great affection for the people that were his patients there, even temporarily. This same thing happened later when he went to Laos.
One of the operations of the Saigon military mission, and this of course has been made public, was to send teams into the north to sabotage the transportation facilities and other things as the communists were coming in to take over. Could you describe some of these operations in detail?
No, I'm
Well, it's in the Pentagon Papers. And
I don't give a damn where it is. It's not my doing. And the charges have been made that I undertook or gave orders to, or saw some things done in the way of sabotage up in North Vietnam at this time when there was a tremendous refugee movement going. All I'd like to say about that is that this took place at a time of tremendous demoralization among the people in North Vietnam when they were having their whole lives torn asunder for them. that a number of these people wanted to hit back at an enemy in any way that they could. An unrecorded bit of the history of the times is that the communists who were leaving South Vietnam at the same moment were performing bits of militant struggle, as they called it, in terms of murders and kidnapping, of hiding arms and ammunition in great supply back in the South, so that there was under the surface very vicious struggle going on at all of this period, and that the people up in the north who wanted to hit back wanted to reciprocate in kind and had to be restrained from committing murders, if you will, and violent actions, and to have this turned over into less less militant types of actions, but still of a satisfactory need. Now, one of the things that was done, the transportation was sort of up in the north. The people, the communist side, was going to take over all the transportation. Now, one of the needs that they would have would be to get out into the highways and byways outside the urban areas and interdict the movement of refugees, which took place. Anything that would hamper their ability to do this, to my mind, was morally okay. And I did give a go-ahead to people to undertake such things. But they weren't against individuals. They weren't against people. They were really very small facet of many other things that were happening. And I feel myself that they were very mild undertaking. The major problems were much more serious than that, demanded most of my attention, and took place down in South Vietnam. Because down in South Vietnam, at this very same moment, the administrative structure had turned into a vacuum in the South. The central government, the provincial governments, and the district governments had been run by the French. The French were pulling out. The Vietnamese were trying to take over, and many of them were untrained in the thing. And being executives and administering the government, communications in the South were very bad, and there had to be a tremendous emergency effort made to train and place civil servants into places throughout the country, to get them into areas where they were physically unsafe and try and protect them, and do so in a space of time that had immediate needs and up to being successfully done inside of 6 months or so. Now, you don't train people and place them in places and get something running that fast, so it was a real emergency situation. And people up in the north would ask for help. I'd make quick visits up there and to see how things are going along, and if they were clamoring for something, all I could do would be to suggest they do the least violent thing when they had violence in their minds and hearts.
What was the overall or longer term effectiveness of having some stay-behind teams in the North? How did that work?
Well, they became teams with passing along information about what was happening. And one of the very first acts, of course, of those new rulers up in the north was to unearth these people and to eliminate them, and which was done. the best of my knowledge, the people that I helped put in the North are still alive, or if not, they're very old people today in the scheme of things, but they kept alive and weren't discovered by the other side.
Was there? Could you look back and say that this was an effective operation? What did it yield?
As an information gathering thing, it was peripherally helpful. I think there were other means of gathering information that were better than that, and that told us more.
Was there any notion at the time that there might be some kind of an uprising in the North against the communists?
The prospects of an uprising in the North, popular nature, were very slim. We knew that people were unhappy about what was going on in the North, and after all, that had been the site of the battleground for many years, so that people had seen what had happened, and there was a secret government of the communists in much of the area. And many times groups of people would try and leave there and be stopped at the roads and couldn't get south, and were being fired upon by troops and police to keep them in place. But the actions of the new leaders were such that there was always an outside chance that large enough sections and segments of the population would get unhappy enough to want to do something. And this happened several times up in the North. But the troops and the police, who both performed much of similar duties up there, were separate from the public and the population, in that they had better food, better rations, better clothing to wear, and were better looked after socially by the government than were the people, so that they remained loyal and were more loyal often to the government than they were to their own family.
Why did you leave Vietnam in '56?
I left Vietnam in 1956 because I felt that my work largely had been done, that there was a great deal of stability in South Vietnam. There were Vietnamese running their own affairs and coming to their own decisions, and able to cope with their problems, and that the Americans who were there were in position to do their help, and there were Americans training the Vietnamese armed forces. There were Americans that had established a very successful training institution of civil servants, and the whole situation had a feel to me that it had a chance of a go, unless some terrible mistakes were made. And I wasn't needed.
You had written that one of the things that was important was to turn this into a pro-people fight instead of an anti-communist fight. Do you think at that stage it had been turned in that direction?
At that time in Vietnam, there was a chance that the people were going to participate enough in political decisions in their country that the people and the government would consider themselves at one in some harmony with each other on the decisions. The communist political moves were always to separate the people from the government and to get their viewpoints to contest with each other to a point where it would be popular to carry out an armed fight against the government and to get support of the people. I felt that when I left at the end of 1956, that the government and the people were on the way towards achieving enough unity and feeling between themselves, so that the communists would have their political rationale and manipulation blunted, and it just kept developing. I didn't feel that it quite reached it yet, but it was well on the way to becoming real.
Looking back, do you think you should have stayed?
I've often asked myself whether I should have stayed or not, and first of all, I lost a lot of sleep while I was there, and I was very tired, and I think even if I'd wanted to stay, I'd have gone off someplace and slept for a month or something. On advice up at the top consuls, I think that there was some jealousies and rivalries that arose after I left, that I had been able to get people talking to each other and working with each other. That I personally regretted that I wasn't there to smooth out some things that were clashes of personality, clashes of background being different, classes based on regionalism and so on. That I used to be able to get them talking with each other.
What do you?
And this reached up into the very top ranks of government there, between the president and the vice president even.
Would you repeat that and say the South?
The clashes and rivalries went up in between the president and the vice president in Vietnam. Both of them friends of mine, both of them old friends of each other, and all it took was someone from the outside, like myself, to remind them of their close ties and so forth in the past to get them talking to each other. After I left, they
Stop. We got the dog going because there's somebody at the
thought it
door.
was on.
Well, I forgot why we stopped.
Let me see. Let me look at my notes.
We stopped because the tape ran out.
No, there was another reason first. There really was.
The dog.
The dog.
The
There was
dog.
an interruption.
Oh, the dog, right.
Yeah.
I'll take the last question again, okay? Bars? You need bars?
Ready?
Whenever you're ready.
Looking back, do you think you made a mistake by leaving Vietnam in '56?
When I left Vietnam in 1956, I was a very tired person. I felt that I should go someplace and sleep for about a month without getting up and trying anything else. So I was physically exhausted, and I'm not certain that by staying on in such a condition I could have been very helpful. Looking back from all this period, there are some things that I might have been able to do by staying that might have been very constructive and possibly even changed the course of events of what eventually happened. For example, the difficulties in part that Vietnam had, or the mistrust between individuals in leadership positions. For a time, even the president and vice president in South Vietnam had some personal feelings going between them that were wrong, and that ordinarily I could have brought them together by making them meet each other and face to face and talking, and which I had done previously. But these were essentially old friends who had started mistrusting each other, too busy to get in and talk to a person and be satisfied in a face-to-face conversation, and letting things drift when a mutual friend could have brought them together and had them just clear up something in a few moments.
Do you think, looking back, that you were beginning to have some doubts about GM's capacity to govern at that time?
I didn't have doubts about his capacity to govern at that time, except in his being flexible enough to take in some of his loyal opposition, so to speak, and giving public men among them a chance to do public service. In this way, he had a smallness of character that I felt was unlike the man that I had seen mostly in him. And he simply let very useful parts of the political and social structure in Vietnam lay dormant or be opponents when they could very well have been pulling together and helping the common cause.
Looking back again, what do you think went wrong in American policy in Vietnam between 54 and 61?
American policy was based on views of Americans who were there, both as officials and as journalists and so on, observers. And as the observers would change, there were always a new generation, you might say, just learning about a country and finding much of it exotic and strange, but explainable to individuals in terms that he was most familiar with, which was his own background and culture. And gradually the Vietnamese image came out as quite an exotic, strange people with wearing strange clothes, looking strange to Americans, with a scenery backdrop that was very different from anything that we know. And as we started seeing them as strangers, the interpretation of their motives and so forth became that of strangers. So a lack of understanding gradually built up as more people were exposed. And in combat times, when Americans were in combat, I myself noticed that the decisive officials, the military leadership and our political leadership there, as well as our economic leadership, kept acting largely as though Vietnam had just started as a country the day before they got there, and it was always new to them. And talking about things, you have to take time out with such people and explain, well, so-and-so is this close to the other one, or this part of the country is noted for this, and you can expect this to happen up there, and to get them reacquainted. This was reflected in a tremendous communication system that reflected the American genius to do things electronically, so that a tremendous amount of observations were flowing into Washington where the decisions were being made in such quantities that they had to be put on computers to be read out and reflected and summed up. Computers don't think the way individuals do. We haven't developed the art yet where we can put in the necessary social science into mathematics to bring the right answers to us. So that some of the mistakes that were made in policy making, some of the little jarrings off the true path, came about by too much reliance on well, from knowing too much and letting machines do some thinking for us.
From 1957 until 61. We had the mission there under Ambassador Durbrow, and the MAG commander was General Williams. And of course, there's a lot on the record about that there was a lot of squabbling within the mission itself. But there's also a report.
And then answer the question. All right.
What?
Just wait a moment. All right, re-ask the question.
Well, it's a difference. Look, what am I do it again anyway?
Yeah, just pick it up from there.
Uh,
Question.
It's been reported that that you recommended that the mission, especially after Kennedy came in, the mission be changed and that Durbrow be replaced. Is that correct?
As far as Ambassador Durbrow is concerned, I visited Vietnam just before the Kennedy inaugural, and Ambassador Durbrow was working day and night, and I felt that he was a physically exhausted person. He was lying down physically to rest a great deal of the time, and as much out of concern for him as anything else in his health. So on, I felt that he should be pulled out and given a chance to recoup a little bit. I remembered what I was like after a period out there of exhaustion, and I felt that Durbrow was very close to exhaustion, and that was the real reason for that. It was faulting some of his decisions too, I felt, by this tiredness, and in such positions you feel like taking the shortest way out of getting something done.
Could you elaborate on some of the decisions you felt made?
I don't recall the decisions definitely at the time, but this was based more or less on the getting together of Americans in top positions and Vietnamese in top positions, and having a chance to afford great candor with each other. And the meetings had taken on a more formal nature than that wouldn't really truly permit such candor with each other. And I felt that under such condition that a change would help the two camps of officials, you might say, get together. I remember this was indicated in a lot of little ways of the attitudes of people about the people in the other camp, and why don't you stay on and help as a friend on this? We can't talk to Americans anymore because they don't understand things. And the Americans saying, well, things have changed since you were last out here. We do this way with people. These are just little indicators of some strain and difficulty.
When you went out at this period, this was during the transition period after President Kennedy was elected.
Just before, well, after he was elected, the transition, and just before the inaugural.
Now, you recall there was an attempted coup against Diem in November of
That's
1960. And when you saw Diem there at that stage, was he shaken up? What was his reaction to that attempted coup?
Diem was still full of feelings and talk about the attempted coup in '60 when I saw him late in '60. He took me up and showed me where 50 caliber machine guns had come in from positions a block away and gone in through the bedroom, across the bed, and hid in the bathroom. And I asked him where he was standing. He showed me he was behind a wall in the bathroom. And he said they meant to kill me because this is where it came across the bed, and close enough to have hit somebody in the bed. And I said, how come you were in the bathroom? He said, I'd gone in there to get something from the medicine cabinet, and just got it open when they opened fire on this thing. So he said, I wasn't going out there while they were shooting, you know.
But did did he feel that the coup was a warning to him that he ought to reform or change?
We had long talks at that period in late '60 about motives of people for trying to kill him, of the opposition that was growing against him. And as a matter of fact, he asked me one time where I'd been the afternoon before. And I said, you having me followed, kept under surveillance? And he pushed that aside, and I said, well, it's obvious you are. And I said, I knew that. I got in with some of your opposition yesterday and made damn sure you didn't know who I was talking to, just to find out what their true feelings are on this thing. And this is what they feel about you. And I told him. And I said, these are good people who love their country, who want to do some things, who, if you had the wisdom to call them in and gave them something to do, would do a superb job of helping you as a leader. And he said, who are they? And I said, I think you know some of them, and you just take any good Vietnamese who isn't in helping you right now, who should be, and you ask them in to do it. And don't let me name them. You go ahead, you know who the leaders are. So the disturbing thing was that these were good people. They were people who had been ministers in previous cabinets, his and others, who had political groups that supported them, and who were tremendously patriotic, and just felt they were spoiling on the vine, and this man was not doing everything he could or should, and that the country wasn't having its best abilities being used. And they were talking very bitterly to me about some of the things that he'd done. And my role, I felt then, and as an American, as an outsider, but wishing them well, as our country did, it was our policy, to let this be known on both sides of what they were thinking on the other, and trying desperately as a mutual friend to bring the people together.
As I recall, Diem and Durbro were getting along very badly at that time.
There were some talks about that, and this is when the thing of Americans don't understand this was really what Jim was telling me at the time. I didn't get in and ask him specifically about how he was getting along with Americans who were there. I was really more concerned about how he was getting along with the Vietnamese who should be doing things to help their country.
You sent a memo to Defense Secretary McNamara on January 17th, 1961, just before the Kennedy inauguration. As a phrase that was in that memo, you said, there are practically no George Washingtons, Thomas Jeffersons, or Tom Paines in Saigon today. What did you mean by that?
By referring to Americans and the American Revolution, and naming such people in this memo that I wrote after my trip out in Vietnam in the end of 1960. I was trying to tell American leaders who were making policy that they were looking to at a country in a time of its peril and of its great need, to not think of them in ordinary terms, that we had our George Washington, we had Tom Paine, we had Ben Franklin, but they didn't out there, and they couldn't solve problems the way we Americans thought they should. They had to solve it from their own backgrounds and their own ways. And if we saw people that didn't look as big in stature as our own heroes from our own revolution, we should have some compassion and some understanding and empathy with the people who were in a tough spot and help them overcome some of their difficulties without just saying, you must do this or we want you to do this, and then walking away, and when it isn't done the way we'd like to see it, just be hypercritical of their performance.
Were you beginning then to have doubts or lose some hope that the United States could encourage the South Vietnamese to act decisively enough against the communists?
I had some concerns that the relationship between American advisors and Vietnamese officials and officers, that their behavior and work would be such that the Vietnamese would grow more confident and stronger and more expert in what they were doing. And I felt that these qualities among the Vietnamese to help themselves, to make their own decisions, to make the best uses of their capabilities and resources were the critical factors in any struggle against North Vietnam.
Now, in that same memo you sent to McNamara, you said that Vietnam ought to be considered to be in critical condition and be treated as, I'm quoting here, a combat area of the Cold War. What were you thinking of specifically? What did you advocate?
The terminology that I used, that Vietnam was critical and that it was in a sort of an emergency situation and should therefore be given a little different intensity of attention by the United States in the Cold War terms, was that I had just been in a country where roads were under fire when they hadn't been when I left there, that big segments of both population and geography, territorial area out in the countryside were being contested by enemy guerrillas who hadn't been in existence before. And in such conditions, there was an armed struggle taking place and a political struggle taking place that would need some change of thinking in how these people were to be helped. And that we shouldn't, if we were going to help these people, go along in the same old standard ways, but do some rethinking and rechecking on it.
Did you have any specific recommendations? Or
I had some. I can't remember what all they were now, but I had a list of recommendations in this memo that, which was what it was some years ago, and I can't remember it. You know, people have quoted things from that memo to me, and I've asked them who wrote it. They said you did, and I hadn't remembered it at all.
Why, looking back, why was it the communist guerrillas were really in many ways much more effective than the South Vietnamese army and political structure?
Well, communist guerrillas are an expression of an authoritarian system of politics. And as such, they have very strict discipline. So part of the reason the North Vietnamese, the communist guerrillas and their regular forces behave so differently than the South Vietnamese stem from some authoritarian practices. Now, there's carrot and stick with this. The stick is the very harsh discipline that they run under. The carrot is the political reality to them that they make use of and apply in their own campaigns, which the communist generals, their leadership in combat, always strove towards having influence and control over the people in the battlegrounds. Our side was always going after defeating the enemy forces, the military. So essentially, the Vietnamese communists were trying to gain control over the people, where we were trying to destroy an enemy. They were political, we were military. And they figured once they got control of the people and their ways that they lived and so on, they'd win the country. Now, this was done by them through a political cadre system that they had throughout their armed forces that reported up through separate channels of command and communication up to their headquarters, where the political cadre would have an equal voice with the military commander, and thus was a very important figure in their armed forces. He would lecture the troops on political motives before going into combat. He would do his best all the time to have them get along with the people and to gain the confidence of the people or alliance with them. After the combat, they'd have an after-action meeting in which they'd like a public confessional. Each of the troops would have to get up and explain what he did wrong in combat and why he was never going to do it again, and apologize to his comrades. Well, you can see what happens in combat when, afterwards you've got to stand up and talk to the man to the right and left of you how you let him down by either wrong thinking or an action at the time that wasn't all gung-ho as he was. So that the motivation of the forces was constantly at a high political pitch, and they were always being in a position of hearing explanations of why they were doing something and what its end results were supposed to be. Where on our side, we simply never got into a troop information and education program that we've had in this country, and the troops often only had vague notions of why they were in a place and were doing something for a government that they knew just the name of a few individuals in.
Now, in a way, it's, and not only by what you're saying, but in many ways by things you've written, and you seem to project a certain admiration for the way the communists organized themselves. And the real question is, what was lacking in our clients that they couldn't organize themselves in this way? What was the ingredient that was missing?
Well, the basic element and the difference between the two sides is that an authoritarian form of control would permit a commander or an official to take a man out who disobeyed and shoot him, kill him. On our side, we don't do such things. There's a legal system that protects an individual. You can charge him, but he goes to a trial and goes through a legal process. There, the legal process is the man in charge metes out the punishment on the spot. So this is one of a many-faceted
I'm talking
type
about
of thing.
I'm talking about the Vietnamese. I mean
I'm talking about Vietnamese.
Well, I mean they were.
A soldier in the Vietnamese army who misbehaved, if he was on the communist side, the officer didn't like what he'd done, it'd shoot him. As an example of the man. I don't want you doing things like this. Boom. And kill him. For the same type of thing in the Vietnamese army on our side, the officer would bring charges against him. And he'd be arrested and have to face a court-martial. And then they'd abide by whatever the judgment was for the punishment on that.
What kind of response, when you talked to President Kennedy about Vietnam, What kind of policies did you recommend to him, and what was his response? What do you think he really wanted in Vietnam?
I've only talked to President Kennedy about some very specific types of problems out in Vietnam, mostly in answers to questions that he'd have about that. And it would usually have been something that was a current and passing type of a problem. And as you asked me about that, I can't stop and think for a minute and recall specific answers. They weren't on any earth-shaking types of things at all. They were usually on some problem about getting a word to the Vietnamese leadership about something and how best to do it and types of things like that. And what do you think would be the response if we said this out there? And sometimes it would be on proposals being put forward that since we control funds to these people, should we threaten, in essence, blackmail them into doing right by withholding funds on that? And usually my responses were along the lines of if the Vietnamese understood thoroughly what these were to be used for and the good of the Vietnamese people that would result from this thing, they would then understand and go ahead. And many times out there were misunderstandings that arose because the words that we use, the terminology, were unknown terms to Vietnamese. And not knowing what they were, but still not wanting to admit to an American that they didn't understand what the word meant, they would, and still wanted to get along with us, they'd sort of, oh yes, we'll do that, without knowing what they were agreeing to.
There was a very popular notion during the Kennedy administration, which was almost a fad about counterinsurgency, development of Green Berets and so forth. Did you share that idea that a counterinsurgency program could be effective in Vietnam?
Well, about counterinsurgency, and actually President Kennedy's personal interest in that, enthusiasm, I agreed with the thought that we needed smaller forces, more expert groups that could be tailored to fit some of the emergencies that we were seeing diplomatically in that period, so that we could respond in small enough ways that we didn't have to bring in all of our armed forces or declare war, but could solve problems economically and in ways that wouldn't impinge at all on the sovereignty of other nations, except enemies. And I don't see sending in big bombers and using lots of armor or sophisticated weaponry against small groups of people out in the countryside.
Well, let me follow that up with a question. You remember there was the mission undertaken by General Taylor and Rostow to Vietnam in the end of 1961, and I gather you went along on that group. One of the things they recommended was putting American combat troops in. How did you feel about that proposal?
As the war in Vietnam heated up during the early Kennedy days, and there were feelings that we should put combat troops in to Vietnam, I did what I could do, which wasn't enough, in expressing views about not getting Americans to fight in a war that conventional forces couldn't understand well enough to be truly effective in, which was a guerrilla type of war. That the war in Vietnam was was such that if the Vietnamese couldn't help themselves sufficiently to be successful in having a viable country, that we as foreigners couldn't do it for them, and we should be able to withdraw gracefully if it became an impossible task. Now you can do that with small forces that are trained to work in very small groups. You can't do that when you commit a whole nation to something, which you do when you have their regular forces go into combat.
Did you speak to Kennedy about that?
I did at one time, but only very briefly. I talked to his brother Bobby about it several times. I wrote some memos. I wrote some memos to not to the President, but to the Secretary of Defense and to others who were seeing him. They had an informal discussion group that used to meet over at Bobby Kennedy's house, and I would talk to some of those who were going to those discussions and give them my viewpoints. At times, too, I would talk to others who were in and out as advisors and close to the top. But my own meetings there were always in response to specific questions that the President had.
Now, in the report, in the recommendations that came out of the Taylor mission, one of them was that a high-level American be assigned as an advisor to Diem. And Diem, according to the record, asked for you. What happened to that idea? Why didn't you take that assignment?
I don't know what ever happened in a period of 1961, but one of the things that I do know is that I was discouraged from having anything to do with the problems in Vietnam, and as a matter of fact, turned around into looking at some of the things in our own hemisphere, in Latin America, because I got in on very few discussions of Vietnamese problems, and most of the military thinking and policy formulation was outside of my ken. Meetings were held I didn't know about at all. And,
well,
why that is, this I don't know.
Did the American military consider you kind of maverick? Or?
I'm certain that they did. I'm certain that I was considered a maverick by many people in the government, and military and civilian. And one of the reasons why is whenever a top official would ask my view on something, I'd try and be as candid as possible and telling them, and it didn't always agree with the views of others, and it was at times apart from our own official views, but I felt a man in a position where he had to make policy and make decisions needed as candid and honest a reply as possible. And just from when I'd say things and seeing the looks on other faces, I know that it wasn't a popular answer that I'd always get.
Excuse me. I know that you were not directly involved in Vietnam in '65, but looking back on that year, which was a real turning point, looking back on the decision to commit combat troops, American combat troops to Vietnam and to start bombing the North, what's your judgment about that? Do you think that was a mistaken policy?
Well, as far as what happened in 1955 and entry...
Start again in '65.
65, as far as what happened in 1965 and the beginning of an American combat role in Vietnam, it was of great concern to me, but I was outside of the government. I'd been retired. I was in no position to present views that were contrary, but I did talk privately to some of the people in government, including the Secretary of Defense at the time, briefly, and to others. But I was always deeply concerned that the war out there was essentially, basically, of political nature, and that you don't solve political problems by military unless you've got a very clear view of where the military can take you for a political solution, which we didn't have. And I knew that the opposition, the Politburo in Hanoi, who were the true opponents in opposite numbers of our president and of his cabinet, and of our Joint Chiefs organization, were superb politicians that had been trained in a school where they had to go to jail at times for their views, and had suffered a great deal by their political views in the past, and were tough and ruthless in their decisions, and that they had a tenacity and a view of their own political goals that we didn't have. And this was part of the reason I didn't want to see us involved in something that was truly beyond our ability, that we didn't even realize was beyond our ability.
Well, one of the arguments, you know, this recent RAND Corporation study in which a number of Vietnamese have written about why, about the defeat. And one of the points that some of them make is that when the American troop commitment came in, the Vietnamese sort of lost the will to fight. Does that sound like a reasonable thesis to you?
One of the problems that came up with Americans in combat alongside the Vietnamese was the difference in approach to problems in combat on the ground in Vietnam. The tendency of the Vietnamese to let somebody else go in and fight was a very understandable one among the people who had been fighting for years, and who hoped somehow or other to live through a war and go back to civilian life at the end, which of course the Americans wanted the same thing. But Americans were bringing in much new equipment and that required technical skills and training that they had to teach the Vietnamese before they could use it. And then gradually, as the Vietnamese struggled to cope with large organizations and more complexities in waging the war, was that, as shown in this recent RAND study, that the Americans would write out instructions or orders, and the Vietnamese started the tendency of merely translating them into Vietnamese and then issuing them and as their own. And some of the American advisors agreed to this type of procedure, since it was a time saver and it was a time of much stress and emergency, and not realizing that by doing this that they were robbing the Vietnamese of initiative and confidence in handling their own affairs. And this was true not only in the military, but it was also over on the civilian side of the government. And it became a type of a thing where lots of the Vietnamese orders were translated from writings by Americans and recognized as such by the Vietnamese and sort of dismissed as not being truly Vietnamese and therefore not worth giving that all-out effort to. And this was part of the tragedy that happened in Vietnam.
Why? How was your assignment to Vietnam arranged when you went back in '65?
I went back in '65 at the request of Henry Cabot Lodge, who told me that it was at the request of President Johnson. And he had wanted me to go out there, he said, to help him, the ambassador, take care of the whole program of pacification that was going on, which was a military-civilian mix. And the problem that I ran into was that there were very fixed ideas.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. I have to interrupt for a moment because you're getting a little.
I need a moment to. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. You want to go back over this, Ed, this question of how your assignment was arranged in 1965? To go back to the lodge.
In 1965, Henry Cabot Lodge had just been appointed as ambassador to Vietnam and asked me to go out there as his assistant to concern myself mostly with the pacification programs that were taking place out there, in which he was personally quite interested. So I went out there as his assistant. He had told me that his request to me actually had come from President Johnson, though I hadn't seen President Johnson about this, and went out as essentially a Foreign Service Reserve officer temporarily. And a little later, after I'd gotten out there, President Johnson gave me the rank of minister. And so this was as a Foreign Service type that I went out. I'd retired from the military by then. When I got out there and tried to cope with the pacification programs, I found that there were a number of U.S. agencies involved in the work. Initially, we tried to work out the U.S. part of the effort by committee means, and tried very hard to succeed in this, but we actually had great difficulties with getting true teamwork on the U.S. side, and that's because each part of our government had its own ideas on what to do, and I must admit I wasn't good at getting a single guiding system on the American side and working with the Vietnamese.
Well, it's certainly no secret that there was a lot of bureaucratic opposition to you inside the American mission. Could you describe some of those problems and difficulties?
Thinking back to my later days out in Vietnam and of getting along with different parts of the U.S. side of the effort, I have a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, just memory of some of the types of things that happened and didn't get along. I think it was a very sad thing that happened, that we Americans can't seem to get thoroughly unselfish in serving our country in such situations. And
be able to work with each other. I don't know whether some of the Vietnamese habits rubbed off on the Americans out there at the time of mistrust of one another. We didn't have mistrust, but we had rivalries. We had people very mindful of the fact that service out in Vietnam seemed to have hampered and ruined some careers by American officials, and that the Americans out there didn't want to have that happen to them, or that they were very ambitious in their own services, which is a proper motive for anybody. But in a war situation where we had young Americans out there risking their lives and fighting and dying, I felt that we, on the civilian end, which I was at the time, should have been far more unselfish in our own looks at our positions and prerogatives and so on.
Do you think, could you recall any specific instances or anecdotes in which you ran into the bureaucratic stone walls?
Well, there were many incidents of fairly small ones of rivalries, of running into bureaucratic stone walls and working with the Americans and Vietnamese at the time. I would just say that the American effort out there was more to the effect of as though Rochambeau and Lafayette and so on and the American Revolution had brought along the court of Versailles with them to this country, and the bickerings going on among the court officials was very similar to what the Americans were doing in the way of organization and well, bureaucracy in effect in the thing, so that anyone who wanted to get out and get a single thing done had to run a course of getting agreements from a number of people to go along and even be permitted to do the most simple things. And I ran into a considerable amount of that, since I didn't have any direct orders from Washington about what I do. I didn't have funds from Congress to expend. I didn't have a clear rule of a line of authority to do certain things. So sometimes decisions were made and we would go to get things done, and there'd simply be the bosses of the people that I'd gotten the agreement with would say, no, we're going to run that, we don't want so-and-so to run that. So that there'd just be a slowing down of the effort.
Well, there's been an observation made that in 1965, after 1965, the war had grown to the stage where it was one great big organization against another great big organization, and that people like you, who were taking a personal and individual approach, really had become obsolete or had been ground over by these two great bureaucracies, because on the communist side it had also escalated into a great big organizational fight. Do you think that's a fair appraisal?
Well, the fact that the war had turned into one bureaucracy against another has some truth in it, but it's only a grain. And that a person who was oriented towards individual efforts as I was would be a maverick and not part of this, and would hurt. There's some truth in that. I think that the same was true on the Vietnamese side, on our side as well as the enemies. But still, there was a relationship there that I adopted myself to between some of the Vietnamese leadership and our mission out there, so that my house was constantly a place with an open door to Vietnamese. It was one of the few American homes that the Vietnamese officials would bring their families to visit. It was one of the places where they felt they could visit socially and in a feeling, an atmosphere of friendship and affection that they could admit to some of their problems that they'd find difficult to do in official gatherings.
What do you think, and you look back on those, can I just take that away from me because I think it's making a little scratching noise. When you look back on that assignment from 65 to 68, what would you say that were your accomplishments, and what would you say were your failures? What was your balance sheet?
A balance sheet on my service out there, failures and accomplishments. I felt that in the way of accomplishments, I gave a constant and ready means of Americans and Vietnamese to go through a glass wall that seemed to separate them, to reach an understanding with each other. This was felt very definitely on the Vietnamese side, and I know Ambassador Bunker, when I left finally in the middle of '68, and thanked me personally for accomplishing this as far as the U.S. mission was concerned. The failures were that the war had grown much larger than any small entity, such as an individual or a small group of individuals. Americans could swing the preponderance of the combat to one way or another. My own usefulness in the past had been that American policy was pretty clear-cut. There were smaller numbers of Americans involved, and that when I would voice something from the ambassador, that was the only voice at that moment being heard by a Vietnamese official. Later, it was in effect too many cooks spoiling the broth. There were all sorts of ideas being put forward, and of people dealing with Vietnamese who didn't speak with a single voice, with even a coordinated voice, so that many things were being heard by the Vietnamese at the time from the American camp. And in this, I was not in with the mode of things at the time, because this wasn't the way I was ever used to carrying out my duties. I'd always had a very clear understanding from the top Americans on the scene of what a problem was, what should be done about it, and what my own part was in that. And by the later end of the 60s, this was no longer really what was being done. The Americans had too massive an organization. There were too many things that needed doing, too many people on the link-up between Vietnamese and Americans that were trying to solve daily problems and coming to grips with them and coming up with different views to have a clear-cut understanding.
There was, at that time, one of the members of your team was someone who was later to become either famous or notorious, depending on your point of view, was Dan Ellsberg.
Right.
What was he like in the days when he was working for you?
Dan Ellsberg, who was with me out there in Vietnam, was a brilliant younger man who struck me as being a good thinker, a man who took many things into consideration when he was examining a problem, and was quite expert at expressing his views afterwards on this. I felt that Ellsberg would give me a very fresh view of a country that was new to him, that he was seeing for the first time up close, and looking at not only at what was happening at the moment, but from a viewpoint that took in discussions that he had had in Washington before that, and had quite a depth of scholarly background on the subject. He was, at the time, initially, he was quite gung-ho about getting into combat or coming in contact with the enemy and doing something as an American in that. I had to keep explaining to him that he was out in a civilian capacity, but he was eager to get out in the countryside, which I was also eager to have him do. The more he could see, the better he would understand the situation. He became a very close friend of John Paul Vann, who was an advisor, a former military officer, who was with our civilian agency on economic aid, and used to love to run the gauntlet of traveling highways where VC had set up ambushes. And this to him was, I feel sure, part of the thrill of serving out in Vietnam.
In any way, have you ever thought about what may have motivated him to steal the Pentagon Papers and publish them?
What motivated Dan Ellsberg to publish the Pentagon Papers has puzzled me in some ways, and I think I understand some of his motives for it originally. Dan tried originally to go through proper channels, you might say, to get a congressional look at the executive department on what was in the papers. And I know that he went up to see some of our senators and congressmen, and when nothing happened, by his, so to speak, working within the establishment, it was then that he apparently felt that he should go public on that the American public deserved that. What happened after that has been very much in the public view about him, and I haven't had contact with Dan. But I think originally that he was motivated by a high sense of principled morals as an American citizen.
Well, let me ask it this way. As you mentioned, he was gung-ho and rather hawkish in his days when he was there with you. What changed him from being a hawk to, if you want, a dove?
I didn't see Dan enough after his initial period of service with me to know what influences were on him that caused him to change. I've had no chance to discuss this with him, and I simply don't know. I know that he married again, and I married a girl who had very strong feelings that he later adopted himself. I know that he had a chance to observe things in Washington that had a very different outlook on Vietnam and on the war than we had known in Saigon together. But someplace in there something happened to him that I simply don't know enough about.
In looking back, you were really involved in Vietnam through 3 administrations: the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration.
Right.
Was there any particular way each one operated? Were there any distinctive qualities about different administrations' approaches to Vietnam?
that would take, to answer the differences of views on Vietnam and different U.S. administrations is something I'd have to reflect on a very long time, and I can't give a quick answer to that at all.
Let me go back to a personal thing. You were, I think, sort of immortalized in a couple of books, if you want to use that word.
I don't.
One is Graham Greene's Quiet American, and you're a figure in The Ugly American called Colonel Hillendale. How do you feel about becoming a fictitious character in that way?
Well, my feelings about becoming a fictitious character or identified with various novels and so on, some of which came out while I was still quite active and trying to do things, I felt, first of all, that it was very harmful. The fictional characters were caricatures in part of some of the things I was trying to do, and one of them in the Quiet American, or The Ugly American, pitted the character against the ambassador and others of people whom I was actually trying to work with at the time and in places, and caused me some personal difficulties and harmonious working relationships immediately. And parts of the character were completely untrue of things that we're doing. It was a composite character, really, of others being drawn on as examples. So that there were things happening that would puzzle me at the time, but also made it quite difficult for me to work. I wish I'd never done that while I was still active. Incidentally, the Asians themselves were way ahead in this game. The Indian ambassador, when I was in the Philippines, had told stories about me being mixed up with Magsaysay there and how he got elected as president. Sihanouk in Cambodia had made a movie in which he is a hero and a member of Khmer Royal Navy intelligence had bested a sort of a stupid American spy who happened to have my name and beat him out for the attentions of the daughter of one of the ambassadors there. And I remember that Chan Sing Kuo, I was told, had passed out similar stories. There were problems in my going to Korea, and that Sigmund Rhee in the old days was afraid that I would try to bring in free elections into Korea. The things that I hadn't known about, but as I was meeting people and talking to them, they'd react in ways, and I'd say, "What are you doing that for?" And they'd tell me these things.
There's some, well, what do you think about The Quiet American as a book?
Graham Greene, who wrote The Quiet American, apparently had some very strange notions about Americans. That I recall one of the things in the novel was that using air-conditioned bathrooms affected the potency of American males. Well, I think the rest of his book was about as true as that notion.
Well, here's the last question for you. I don't want to maybe sort of give you a moment for reflection of it. Looking back on this great experience, tragic experience, what do you think the lessons of Vietnam are? What should we have learned from Vietnam?
The lessons we should have learned from Vietnam and the Vietnam War are, first of all, that we should always be true to our own principles, American ones, the ones from our own history, the ones that we instinctively tend to follow and are away from any trends and so forth, but are are long range in themselves. We felt that there's a strong viewpoint that it should have taught us not to ever look upon ourselves as the world policeman. I don't think that's the point at all. I think that the Vietnam War should have taught us to be true to our own principles throughout. I think that the separation of military and civilian authority should permit more input on strategy from the military into our political leadership, and I think that what happened to us was that in Vietnam we had presidents. We had whatever else you think of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. They were professional politicians. They were from a very tough breed of politicians in America, and yet they were commanders in chief, were national leaders in the war in Vietnam, fighting it in a military way. While their opposition, the Lê Duan and Ho Chi Minh and Giap and others in the Politburo in Hanoi were fighting it as a political war. And I cry inside thinking that our tough, expert politicians never used their political sense in the way that we waged war in Vietnam. I don't think that if they'd ever felt that this was their subject, politics was the thing needed in Vietnam, if they'd ever used that the war would have been very different.
Well, can I just ask you for comment on the fact that Ho Chi Minh and Lê Duan and Giap were Vietnamese in Vietnam and we were Americans in Vietnam? And if we reverse that, how well would the Vietnamese do if they were trying to wage a war in the United States? I mean, weren't we...
I think the Vietnamese used their political war in the United States. I'm not going to say that they directed all of the popular dissent that was expressed here, but they certainly had some influence on it. I don't think that the initial VC movies that were the start of the early sit-ins at our colleges and so on just came in like topsy into this country. Someone got them in here and got them shown up at Columbia University and so on, and that what happened in the United States was almost identical with what had happened in metropolitan France and in Paris in an earlier war that the communists in Vietnam had waged, in which later on they took great credit for changing Mao's strategies over to fit hitting an enemy at home, which was different than Mao had ever done. I lost my train of thought.
It's okay. I think that's fine. Unless you have any other questions.
I think what you were... Try that last question again, because
that we could have won. And you get into such things as the war crime trials after World War II and so forth, which were political implements.
Thank you so much.
Right. Be careful, don't move too far with that.
Thank you.